Today I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more insane stories about people who went to forbidden locations around the world and what happened to them. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go roller skating with you, but before you get to the rink, loosen all of their wheels. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism, they were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night, they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Hiva. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, "Sure, I'll be your guide." Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, "You two go, I'll meet you over at the boat." So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach, waiting for Stefan to return. But after quite a while, and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water. And from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat, and he's waving to her. He's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt, and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, "Where is he? What happened to him?" And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns, she's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life, and because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water, and when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around, because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan, and initially they couldn't find him and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century, and they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arihano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arihano had gone on their hunt, Arihano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arihano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arihano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arihano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arihano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arihano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before, because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel, because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. and then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just gotta have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous, to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go. And they go pretty far out, but if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen, he'll probably get hypercapnia, he won't be able to get to the surface, and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't, and he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body, and they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those 3 divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface, and he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other 2 had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's 2 dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over, and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital. They would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite. It said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those, but over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia, because it was thousands of miles away from civilization, and the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread, and just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter, there's no food, there's no tools, there's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there, made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to go roller skating with you, but before you get in the rink, loosen all of their wheels. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, here on YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. There is this horrifying creature that lives on a tiny uninhabited island in the southwestern Pacific that lives underground, and at night it will come out and it will eat anything from coconuts to fish to birds to pigs to people. And in today's top story, we're going to learn about someone that accidentally wound up on this island totally stranded and came face to face with this nightmarish creature. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next cold day, sneak behind the like button and slap their ears and then run away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Dr. Guy Garman, also known as Doc Deep, was an avid scuba diver, and in 2015 he decided he was going to put his scuba diving to the test and try to break the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. At the time, the current record was 1,090 feet, set by a man named Ahmed Gaber in 2014. Guy's plan was to go down to 1,090 feet and then keep going to 1,200 feet, and that would be his record-setting mark. But in order to do that, you need a dive site that goes down to 1,200 feet. But luckily, Guy did most of his scuba diving off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean, and that area was known for an incredibly deep dive spot. Now, when most people think of scuba diving in the Caribbean, they think of beautiful clear water and amazing coral reef and exotic fishes, and everyone's so happy and it's so great and the water's so warm. And off St. Croix, that was true. But if you continued going offshore about 250 feet, you'd reach a drop-off that's known as the wall. And we're not talking about a gradual drop-off. We're talking about the seafloor going from flat to turning 45 degrees and going straight down 2 miles into a complete black abyss. Now, the only people that are actually allowed to dive into the wall are very experienced scuba divers with all the certifications. But if you're a tourist and you come to St. Croix, you can still scuba dive off the coast where it is beautiful and shallow and warm and there's reefs and fish, but you're allowed to swim out to the edge of the wall. And people report getting out there and standing on the edge of this cliff, looking in the water with their mask and not being prepared for how intimidating it is. I mean, you're standing on one side where behind you is like this tropical paradise, and in front of you is this seemingly endless void where we don't even know what's down there. I mean, we've only explored 10% of the ocean. These deep portions of the ocean we can't get down, so we don't know what's down there. What we do know is that sometimes whales will dive down into these deeper sections of the water, and scientists will be tracking their dive, and when they come up again, after only going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, they'll return with these massive bites taken out of them, because apparently there are creatures down there that we haven't discovered yet that are so big and so aggressive that a whale seems like a reasonable thing to go after for food. And so imagine standing on the edge of this cliff looking out and being like, what's down there? Well, our boy Guy decides, I'm gonna find out what's down there and I'm gonna do my record-setting dive at the wall. And so after meticulous planning and hiring a support team that's gonna be there to help him do this dive, he, his wife, and his son fly to St. Croix and they get ready to do this dive. Guy had arranged for a line to be lowered right at the edge of the wall that was weighted down by an anchor that was gonna go down all the way to 1,300 feet. And they would put a metal placard at the 1,200 foot mark on the actual line so that when Guy went down, he would reach that placard at 1,200 feet. That's the record-setting mark. He would use a grease pen to mark the placard to indicate, I made it, this is legitimate, and then he would go back up, and that's how the dive was gonna go. And so in the early morning of August 15th, 2015, Guy, along with his big support team, they head out to the edge of the wall. Guy gets into the water along with his son, who's gonna go down with him for the first 200 feet, and he looks up at the support boat and he gives him the okay. He's ready to start the dive, and then he and his son give the signal, they're ready to go down, and they start their descent into the void. As they're sinking lower and lower and lower in the water column, it's getting darker and darker until it's completely and totally pitch black. They reach the 200-foot mark, they come to a stop as was planned, and Guy's son Kip would give his father a squeeze for good luck because they can't communicate, and then Kip would go back up, and Guy on his own continues down to the 1,200-foot mark. Once Guy was on his own, a timer started because it's very important to track how long he's down at depth, and his team was expecting him to be back up at the 350-foot mark in 38 minutes from when his son left. But 38 minutes came and went, and he was not at the 350-foot mark. But even though this is a big problem, Guy had a whole bunch of extra air canisters with him, and so if he ran into any sort of problem, he would be able to continue to breathe air and fix the problem before coming up. It would just mean longer decompression stops along the way up. And since he was tethered to the guideline, they knew he couldn't drift away. And so they just had to wait and hope that he ran into some problem and that he would fix it eventually and then he would come back up again. But he never did. They couldn't really send a rescue mission down to get him because Guy was going so deep. He was the only one that was able to get down there. No one else was qualified or would be able to do it or had the right equipment for it. He was totally on his own down there. It would take 3 days before they were able to get the right equipment that was able to pull this lineup out of the water, and attached at the end of it was Guy, and he was deceased. He had drowned. But the really scary thing about what happened to Guy is when he went down into that abyss, he had all these extra air canisters attached to him. And so presumably he went down the line, probably all the way down to the record-breaking mark, and then he got trapped somehow. And as he's trapped on this line in total darkness, surrounded by who knows what down there, probably for several hours, he just cycled through his backup air canisters wondering, am I gonna run out of air and drown? Or am I gonna get attacked by some animal down here? There is this tiny little stream that winds its way through a forest in Yorkshire, England called the Bolton Strid. It's not very wide, you could jump over it. It doesn't appear to be very deep, it looks like maybe a foot or two, and it's not moving very fast, but that's all an illusion. There are signs up all over the place that say do not go near the Bolton Strid, it kills people. Because just beneath the surface of this seemingly tame water body is a natural booby trap that has a 100% mortality rate, meaning every single person that has ever stepped foot in the Bolton Strid has died. In 1998, Barry and Lynn Colletwer were walking along the Bolton Strid on their second day of their honeymoon, and all of a sudden a torrential downpour starts just raining down on them, and the rocks they were on suddenly got pretty slick, and Lynn slips and falls into the Strid. Barry, being a good husband, runs over to try to save her, and he too falls into the Strid. A man named Desmond Thomas was on the other side of the Strid, and he saw Barry as he was running for his wife, and he saw him fall in, and he watched Barry's face as he was looking at him as if he was going to stay afloat at the top. Desmond said it looked like someone came up and grabbed his leg and yanked him under the water, and he didn't see him again. Lynn's body was found 6 days later in West Yorkshire, and Barry's body was found over a month later, 10 miles downstream. In another case, in 2010, an 8-year-old boy named Aaron Page was playing by the Bolton Strid for his birthday. There's an area that's totally safe, that's away from the Strid, where people have picnics and that kind of thing. And he came down to the edge of the Strid and was running on the rocks, and he slipped and he fell in. Now, an adult saw this happen and they ran over and they were able to grab onto him while he's in the water. But the pull from inside the water was so strong that this person couldn't hold on to this child, who was eventually sucked under and dragged away and drowned. And beyond these two reports, there's dozens of others of people trying to jump over the Strid and falling in and drowning. So why is the Bolton Strid so deadly? If you look at this picture, this is of the River Wharfe, and it's just a little ways upstream of the Bolton Strid. And all this water in the River Wharfe gets funneled into the Bolton Strid. And the way it fits through that narrow section that is the Bolton Strid is the river turns on its side. So when you're looking at the Bolton Strid and you think, oh, that's not that deep. Well, it is that deep. It's at least as deep as the River Wharfe is wide. And if you look at it on the surface and you say, oh, well, the Bolton Strid's not moving very fast. Well, that's because underneath the surface there is a whipping current. And in fact, the current that runs through the Strid is so strong that if you were standing on one of the rocks overlooking the water, you're looking down into the Bolton Strid. Well, you're not really standing on solid rock. You're kind of standing on a ledge. You just don't know it because the water meets the edge of the ledge. Underneath the rock you're standing on, the water has completely carved it out. So if you were to fall in, before you get sucked under the water, you would get sucked against the side and you would disappear under one of those shelves and go way far back underneath these rocks. And then you get sucked under and drown. And a lot of people who fall into the Strid, they don't make it out the other side. They don't get downstream. They get pulled into all these different caverns and tunnels that have been carved out by that current, and they're trapped in there forever because no one's going in to retrieve them, not even with scuba gear. Because if you get in there with scuba gear, the current will push you into these different caves and you aren't getting out again. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search was launched for them, but they can't find them. And after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Maroro's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake, because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Island and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that, and so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream, and there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle, and there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island, they get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly dangerous. So that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you thought of them, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, on the next cold day, sneak behind the like button and slap their ears before running away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. My actual reaction to today's top story when I first learned about it was, oh my God, that might actually be the worst thing that can happen to you. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please kidnap the like button, cover them in barbecue sauce, and then drop them off on the beaches of Niku Island. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of February 28, 2013, 37-year-old Jeff Bush was just getting home from his job as a laborer. He walked through the front door of his very modest single-story home in Seffner, Florida, which is just outside of Tampa, and he walked into the kitchen where his sister-in-law and his niece were, and he said hi to them, and he checked in on them. They both lived with Jeff, as did Jeff's brother, Jeremy. After a few minutes of small talk with them, he left the kitchen and went to his own bedroom, the same bedroom he had been sleeping in since he was a little kid. He had grown up in this house. He goes into his room and he hops on the bed, turns on the TV, and looks forward to relaxing for the next couple of hours before going to sleep. A couple of hours later, Jeremy comes home from his second job. He actually worked during the day with Jeff at the same company, but had to pick up additional shifts at night because he needed to support his daughter and his wife. And so he comes home and he goes through the front door and he goes over to Jeff's room and he knocks on the door and he opens it up and he says, "Hey Jeff, we don't have work tomorrow. I just found out, so feel free to sleep in tomorrow." Jeff was pretty happy about this and he said, "Okay, thanks for letting me know." And then Jeremy shut Jeff's door, turned around and walked out to see his wife and his kid. About an hour later at 11 p.m., Jeremy, his wife, and his kid are on the other side of the house from where Jeffrey is, and they're laying in bed watching TV when all of a sudden they hear what sounds like a car smashing into the side of the house. It was extremely loud, and immediately Jeremy jumps out of his bed and he hears from the other side of the house Jeff yelling out for help. Jeremy runs into the hall, his wife's right behind him, and there's no damage in the hall, there's no smoke, there's no fire, and they see Jeff's bedroom is still shut, so they run down the hall, they open that door up, and it's dark in his room, and as Jeremy's trying to figure out what he's looking at, his wife reaches behind him and flicks on the switch, and the light from the room illuminates the most bizarre and horrible scene. Jeff, the bedroom, everything, it's all gone, and it's been replaced by this massive sinkhole right in the middle of the room. As Jeff was laying on his bed, apparently the sinkhole had opened up, and when it did, it completely opened up. Jeff fell into it along with everything else in the room, and then it kind of churned on top of him, like it opened its mouth and then squeezed up over him so that when Jeremy is looking in, it actually looked like a flat layer of dirt. He could only see the corner of a bed poking out. There was no sign of Jeff. He saw the cable from the TV was still coming off the wall and going into the pit and disappearing into the dirt. And so Jeremy starts screaming for Jeff, and he can hear Jeff's muffled screams as he's yelling for him to come save him. And so Jeremy, without any hesitation, jumps into this hole, which right then, it was only about 6 to 10 feet deep. It would end up becoming 60 feet deep over the next couple of days. But initially, it was only about 6 feet deep. He jumps in and he starts using his hands to try to burrow down to his brother. But for every scoop he was able to remove, about 10 times that would be created as the walls continued to collapse and this hole continued to sink and grow. Jeremy's wife calls the police, and Jeremy gets a shovel and he goes back into the hole and he's digging as fast as he can, but he's really making no progress, and he's screaming for his brother, but eventually Jeff's yells for help stop, and he can't hear him, he can't see him, and he's just digging, but he knows he's gone. When the police arrive, they forcibly remove Jeremy from the hole. He did not want to leave his brother. They pulled him out of the house, they pulled his wife and his kid out, and they've evacuated the area, and they had to rope it off because they didn't want anybody going near it because they didn't know how big this hole was going to get. They weren't sure if it was going to suddenly open up and engulf, the whole stretch of the street. And so all of Jeff's family just had to watch in horror as they basically did nothing to try to help him. They had to let the sinkhole basically develop before they were able to actually go in there and try to help him. And so if he had been alive, there was just no way they could have saved him. After several hours, they were able to go up close and feed in this microphone system that they put on top of the actual sinkhole that would apparently be able to pick up sound if Jeff was making any sound whatsoever. And it wasn't picking up any signs of life. And at this point, they determined that he was deceased. But before they could get their audio recorder out of the hole opened up again, got even bigger, and swallowed the recorder into the hole. But despite getting bigger and wider and actually getting big tools in there to start trying to pull stuff out of it, they could never find Jeff's body. And so the decision was made to leave him wherever he is, somewhere in the sinkhole, and they filled it in with gravel, and then they knocked down the house as well as the two other neighboring houses. And so to this day, Jeffrey's body is still somewhere underground in that sinkhole. In 2008, Joshua Maddox was an 18-year-old guy living in a small city in Colorado. He was known for having a very carefree attitude. He was kind of a free spirit. He had really long hair. He liked to play the guitar. He loved music. And he spent a lot of his time free writing. His parents were divorced, so Josh lived with his father, whose name was Mike, and his two sisters, who were named Kate and Ruth. On May 8th, he told his sister Kate that he was going for a walk as he left the house. Josh loved being out in nature and regularly went out walking around the woods by himself, so this was not out of the ordinary for him. But that night, when he didn't come back, that was out of the ordinary, and the family was pretty concerned. By the next day, when he hadn't shown up and they couldn't get in touch with him, and they called around and no one knew where he was, they would go to the police and file a missing person report. So the police launched this massive search, but there's nothing really to go on besides what he told Kate before he left, which was, "I'm going for a walk." So there wasn't really a good starting point, and so they weren't getting anywhere. As days turned into weeks, turned into months, and no one's heard from him, no one knows what happened to him, hope was fading that they were going to find him alive. In fact, hope was fading that they were even going to find his body. 7 years after Josh went missing, a startling discovery was made. A builder named Chuck Murphy had this little tiny cabin he owned in the middle of the woods, about a mile away from where Josh's family home was in Colorado. The cabin had fallen into disrepair. At one time he might have used it, but now the land it was on was much more valuable than the cabin itself. So the decision was made to demolish the cabin and sell the land. And so he brings out a demolition crew, they start knocking down walls, and when they crack open the chimney, when they're standing inside of the cabin and the chimney is now coming down, they see a body crammed into the chimney in the fetal position with its legs over its head. Chuck calls the police, who come over, and they're able to identify this body as being that of Josh Maddox. The cabin had been consistently overlooked during the different searches for Josh, because it just didn't look like a place anybody would go. It was like this broken down, caving in pile of wood, and they just kind of wrote it off. And no one thought to actually go check it out. Chuck, the owner of the cabin, said that he was really never there, but he had gone in the time between when Josh disappeared and now, and he said when he went inside, there was no signs of anything unusual. It looked like the same old cabin, and he was only in there for a couple of minutes, but he didn't see anything. The autopsy revealed Josh had been wedged inside of this chimney for 7 years, meaning as soon as he went missing, he wound up wedged in the chimney less than a mile from his house. He had no drugs in his system, he had no trauma to his body, so no broken bones or knife marks or gunshot wounds. Initially, authorities said this death was an accident, and what must have happened is Josh came to this cabin and he wanted to get inside. It was locked, and so he thought he would go through the chimney and he got stuck. But Chuck Murphy said, no, that's not possible, because I put this really heavy-duty rebar cage over the top of the chimney cap to prevent animals and other debris getting inside the chimney. And certainly a person could not have fit through there. However, they couldn't go back and confirm there was indeed this chimney cap because the cabin had already been demolished. In addition to the chimney cap that kind of contradicted this whole accident hypothesis, there were a few other significant unanswered questions about this case. The first one was there was this big breakfast bar, this wooden breakfast bar that was ripped off the wall inside of the cabin and placed up against the fireplace. And if that wasn't there, you would be able to see the underside of Josh because he was tucked up just underneath where you could see. So that means either Josh ripped it off the wall and put it in front of the chimney before going into the chimney, or he was in the chimney and somebody else broke it off and put it in front. The second big question mark is Josh's body position. His legs were over his head, so his position indicates he would have had to go into the chimney head first. And so I don't know about you, but if you were going to go into a chimney, I would not be leaping head first. It just seems counterintuitive and unnecessarily risky. And the third question mark are Josh's clothes, or lack thereof. He was only wearing a shirt. He didn't have pants or underwear or anything else on, just a thermal shirt. And the clothes he didn't have on were neatly folded and stacked inside the cabin next to the fireplace. Meaning, for this to be an accident, he would have had to gain access to the cabin, take off most of his clothing, fold it up, put it next to the fireplace, rip off the breakfast bar, put it in front of the fireplace, go outside, climb onto the roof, rip off the rebar cage, and then only wearing a t-shirt, go head first down a chimney, and then get stuck and die. Very few people, including authorities, buy this is truly just an accident, but they're lacking evidence to suggest it's something else. And so to this day, it remains an accident. On December 6, 1941, 20-year-old U.S. Navy sailor Clifford Olds met up with a couple of his shipmates at the Monkey Bar for a night out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A barmaid took this picture of Cliff all the way on the right with his friends and then offered to sell this back to them, to which they said, "That's a ripoff, you can keep it." This would be the last picture of Cliff alive. The next morning, just before 8 a.m., Cliff was back on board his ship, the USS West Virginia. He was starting his workday when the Japanese launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Cliff's ship was a prime target and was quickly hit with 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, hundreds of people are dying on board, and very quickly his ship is starting to sink. On board a Navy ship, there's all these different conditions the ship is set to depending on what you're doing, whether you're at war or you're just docked in peacetime, and all of these different conditions have very specific instructions. And one of those conditions is condition Z. Better known as setting Z, if the captain of a ship calls this out over the loudspeakers, every single hatch inside of that ship is shut and locked. If your ship is sinking and you say set Z, you are sealing all of those compartments so no more water can flow into them, and you can maintain a little bit of buoyancy so you don't sink quite as fast. But if you set Z as your ship is sinking, especially if you're getting attacked and there's all these holes in your ship, there's a good chance when you seal those hatches, you're going to be sealing people inside of these rooms and they will not be able to get out again. So when that call comes out over the loudspeakers, set Z, everybody knows to get the heck out of their compartments so that they do not get trapped inside of one of those rooms. On Cliff's ship, set Z was called over the loudspeakers, and Cliff, along with Ron Endicott, who was 18, and Buddy Costin, who was 21, were at the bottom of the ship in the freshwater pump room, and when someone came by and shut and sealed their room, they did not see them in there. And so probably the 3 of them ran to the door and were banging on it and trying to get someone's attention. But in the chaos of the moment, that person on the other side of the door that could have opened it up again was now gone. Even though the set Z procedure did prevent water from going into certain cabins on the West Virginia, it still would sink to the bottom of the ocean along with 17 other ships. The next day, there was a whole bunch of Marines that were on the dock right next to where the wreckage of the West Virginia was underneath the water. And as they're standing on the dock, they start hearing a banging sound. And at first they think it's probably just a salvage team or it's some strap clanging against the side of one of these ships. But they started to notice the tapping sounds started to sound like intentional rhythms that a human might make. And it dawned on them that someone is trying to get our attention underwater. There are people trapped in the West Virginia. But when the Marines ran to their superiors and told them there are people trapped inside of the ship, we have to get them out, they broke the horrible news that there's nothing they could do for them. If they went down and began trying to cut a hole in the side of the ship so they could swim out, as soon as there's even a tiny little hole on the side of that ship, there's so much pressure that it would rush inside and fill that space almost immediately, and they wouldn't be able to cut a hole big enough, fast enough, and so cutting into the ship is going to kill them. Also, just lighting that torch presents a unique problem because there's so many chemicals in the water from all of the attacks that happened the day before. We run the risk of lighting a fire or lighting off an explosion that could take even more life. And because they were still months away from being able to raise the ship out of the water, which would save them, the decision was made that we're going to have to let them die. And so for the next 16 days, Marines and sailors were put on guard duty right next to the wreckage of the USS West Virginia, and they would listen to the tapping as they desperately tried to tell people, come down here, save us, we're alive, we're not going anywhere, please help us. And the Marines and sailors were so distressed about this. It was so horrible to listen to. They would cry and cover their ears because they wanted to save them. They're so close, but they're so far away. Finally, on Christmas Eve, the banging stopped. 6 months later, they were finally able to raise the West Virginia out of the water. And as crews were going through all the different compartments and removing bodies, they got to the freshwater pump room where Cliff, Ron, and Buddy had been. They open it up and they find 3 bodies, and they realize right away the torture these poor guys had gone through. Inside this airtight section was this locker full of food rations. They're also in the freshwater pump room, and so they just opened up the tank and they had all the fresh water they needed. But what they didn't have enough of was air. And so for 16 days, sitting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, knowing they're not going to get out of here, they slowly suffocated. And we know they were alive for those 16 days because they had a calendar where they were marking off each of the days they were down there in red pen. This story was so distressing, the Navy decided not to share the information about what happened to those 3 to their families. It wasn't until years later the truth came out, but even today, on memorials and monuments commemorating what happened at Pearl Harbor, they are listed, Cliff, Buddy, and Ron are listed as killed in action on December 7th. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the like button, cover them in barbecue sauce, and then drop them off on Niku Mororo Island. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.